Hello, my friends. Hello, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned for my weekend reading report. It's time for my weekend reading report, the action-filled program where I talk about all the stuff that I read during the previous week. And I did read some stuff. As usual, it wasn't as much as I would have liked to have read, but I did manage to read some stuff. So, let's talk about the stuff that I read last week and the stuff I'm reading now and all of that exciting business. So, have to break out my list for the 500 book challenge. The challenge where I have to read 500 books I own before I will buy any new ones. And I have a list here, and at 159, book 159, the book I read was The Vampire Lestat. It's The Vampire Lestat. I read this book on my Kindle, so I don't actually have a physical copy to show you. I have all of Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles and actually a lot of her other books on my Kindle, and I don't have physical copies of any of them for some reason. I'm not sure why, but I don't. But I read this, and it was fantastic. I loved it. I loved it. I loved The Vampire Lestat. I had read this before. It had been decades. It's been decades since I've read it. But I liked it probably even more now. I mean, as far as the structure of the book is concerned, Interview with the Vampire, the first book in the series, is probably a better book. But I liked The Vampire Lestat better. It's more ambitious, it seems to me. It's really opening up the world of the vampires. It's delving into some of the mysteries of the vampires, and we get to know some of the vampires that were mentioned or appeared in the first book, and we get to know them better. Lestat is very different in this book. In the first book, Lestat was basically the villain of Interview with a Vampire. But he was also the most interesting character in that book. So it's not surprising to me that Anne Rice brought him back as the main character in this book and in most of the other books in the Vampire Chronicles, I believe. Because he really is an interesting character and so entertaining and so fun to read about. But we also got to find out about other vampires, like Armand and Marius, and we get their backstories. And there's just a lot of stuff in this book, and it's really entertaining. Highly recommended. A worthy sequel to Interview with the Vampire, certainly. I hear that I remember I read the following book, Queen of the Damned, and I remember that being good. I remember I didn't like it as much as The Vampire Lestat, but close. I remember it being really good. So I look forward to reading that, although I don't know when I'll be able to get to it. I'll squeeze it in somewhere, because this was a lot of fun. So yeah, The Vampire Lestat. It's fantastic. Absolutely love that book. So that was book 159. Book 160. Book 160 was this mostly crappy book. This is Thor Marvel Epic Collection of Thor, Blood and Thunder, Marvel Epic Collection of Thor, Volume 21. This has Thor stories from 1993 and 1994. So I am, for my Marvel Master Plan project, I am reading every issue of Thor from the first run of Thor, which ran from the early 1960s up until 1996. So I'm almost at the end. I'm almost done with Thor, which is really strange because I've just been so used to reading Thor's adventures every single day since last October, and I've had a great time for the most part. There have only been a couple periods of Thor which really weren't that great. There was a short period right before Walter Simonson took over the book, which wasn't great, although it was better than most of this. This has some of the crappiest issues of Thor ever, although it does get better towards the end. So most of this is taken up with a storyline called Blood and Thunder, which took place not just in Thor, but also in the Silver Surfer and Warlock. Warlock is actually a character that had a couple of books going on in the 90s, apparently, for some reason. And Jim Starlin wrote most of it. And the problem with this storyline is so Thor he'd been gone for a while, and he had been replaced by the character that later became Thunderstrike. And Thor, the original Thor, finally came back. We're finally back to reading the adventures of the original Thor. But wait, now he's an insane maniac. The geniuses at Marvel at this time decided, hey, I know how to get people to read Thor. Let's make him an insane villain. We'll take the noblest character in the Marvel Universe and make him an insane villain who just wants to kill all his friends and destroy Asgard for really no reason at all. Let's just do that. So they did. So Thor is an insane villain, and it's stupid for a number of reasons. First of all, Thor would just, even if Thor became mentally unbalanced, if Thor was suffering from mental illness, let's say, he wouldn't be the character that they're presenting him as in most of this epic collection. And if he did become an insane villain, he would immediately lose the power to use his hammer. You have to be worthy. You have to be worthy to lift and use Thor's hammer. Insane maniacs who want to kill their friends and destroy whole cities of innocent people are not worthy to lift Thor's hammer. So that hammer should have just fallen out of his hands. But the people at Marvel didn't care. Jim Starlin didn't care. They just decided, hey, let's do this. That'll be interesting. And so they did. So we have several issues where Thor is insane. Finally, he stops being insane, and then he's just kind of a dick when he stops being insane. He gets real pissed off at Odin for no reason, really, and he decides to leave Asgard and just go to Earth and have adventures on Earth. The one good thing, though, is that at that point, Roy Thomas, and this surprised me because I didn't know this, Roy Thomas returned to the book. Roy Thomas, who has written some of the greatest comic book stories ever, he's written some of the not so greatest comic book stories ever, but he did all those great issues of Conan. He's a really good comic book writer, and he had a really interesting run on Thor years before in the 1970s. So here in the 1990s, Roy Thomas returns to Thor. He doesn't seem to be as good in these issues, and I'm wondering if it's because I don't know how much of the plots of these stories were Roy Thomas's ideas or whether they were the ideas of the editors. At this point, Thor is hanging out with this really lame group of idiots called the God Pack, who are now probably justly forgotten. And he gets this, it's the 90s, of course, so he has to change outfits. And he gets this ridiculous 90s costume. I mean, he just looks... the 90s, man, was not kind to some characters, not kind to Thor. And so he has this idiotic outfit. Most of these stories are illustrated by MC Wyman, who seems to have vanished after the 90s. I don't know whatever happened to that guy, but he drew a lot of these stories. But the artwork, as ridiculous as some of it is, isn't the problem. The problem is a lot of the writing in this book, right up until the end. So I am continuing Thor. I read that, so now I'm continuing it with Epic Collection Volume 22, which has stories from 94 to 95. So I really am almost done. There's this Epic Collection, there's one more Epic Collection of Thor, and then I'm done with Thor. And I'll be moving on to the Fantastic Four. This seems to be a lot better. And it looks like Roy Thomas wrote the stories for almost this whole thing. So I'm thinking it has to be better than the previous volume just because of that. And so far, I've just read a little bit. And yeah, it's better. So we'll see. We'll see how this is. I mean, it certainly can't be worse. So there's that. on to book 161. Book 161 was this book. This is Assignment in Eternity by Robert A. Heinlein. Heinlein is an author I haven't read too much. I've read some Heinlein books, but right now, this month, it is Rocket Summer. Rocket Summer is going on all month long in July. And right now, or the past week was the 1950s. Excuse me, the 1940s. It was the 1940s. And all of the stories in this book, there are 4 stories in this book, 2 long stories, 2 short stories. They're all from the 1940s. And I discovered, or I rediscovered, why I don't actually read too much Heinlein. The stories were interesting with the exception of the first story was called, let me not forget what the first story was called. It was called Gulf. The first story was called Gulf. And it was pretty good. The first story was pretty good, although it did have a thing about it that I'm going to mention that all of the other stories have as well. And most of the stories in this book seem more like fantasies than they do science fiction. The science fiction, or the science in these stories is so, well, it's pseudoscience, really. The pseudoscience in this is so silly that they really do read like fantasies, particularly the second story, which is a time travel story. The second story is a story called Elsewhen, which is a fantasy story. I mean, there's no way you could really call it science fiction because the science fiction element in it is so thin as to be non-existent. But even as a fantasy story, it's not very good. And there's a lot of that in this book. So here's the thing about Heinlein, which I rediscovered. Heinlein does this thing, where he will take a political idea of his, like one of his political ideas or one of his social ideas or one of his dopey pseudoscientific ideas, and he'll put them in his books, and which is fine. I mean, I read a lot of books with crazy stuff in it, but the way he does it is he lectures you. He will lecture you about these ideas. I mean, he will have characters lecture other characters, but really what he's doing, what it feels like he's doing, is he's lecturing you. He's lecturing you, the reader. And it doesn't help that what he's lecturing you about is usually an idea that is obviously wrong or ridiculous, And I had nothing against, like, in books for there to be telepathy or ESP or telekinesis. These are all things that, of course, do not exist in the real world. There's no science, no real science to back any of them up. There is no real evidence that stands up to any scrutiny to back up ideas like ESP or telekinesis. And that's fine. Ideas like this don't have to exist in the real world. I'm happy to have these things exist in books. I like Edgar Rice Burroughs a lot, and he has a lot of ridiculous ideas in his books, But Tarzan doesn't lecture me. John Carter doesn't lecture me. There are things like the ninth ray in Edgar Rice Burroughs, which is a ray which you can harness and store and use to transform into an atmosphere. I mean, it's like, what? But Edgar Rice Burroughs, man, he's just like, you know what, just go with it. I'm just going to mention this thing, just go with it. And you're like, okay, I'll go with it. But if Heinlein had written the Barsoom series, he would be like, oh, the ninth ray? I am going to Heinsplain to you about the ninth ray. Listen, here's the thing about the ninth ray. Those ridiculous scientists on Earth, they're too idiotic and shallow to believe in the ninth ray. They only believe in things, that you can, judge from evidence or using the scientific method. But let me tell you about the ninth ray. And he will just he will just go on, And that's what he does in these stories. He will use his characters who are usually very smug and very smug and arrogant and unlikable, and they will lecture you about whatever dopey idea he's trying to put across. And it's just annoying. It's just and they just go on. They just go on and on and on. There are 4 stories in this book. There would be like 12 stories in this book if the characters would just shut up. If they could just shut up and just get on with the story instead of lecturing you about all this. Anyway, thus that's my reason I don't really get along with Heinlein, I think, and I rediscovered it with this book. This book is not bad. It's a good book, and the stories are mostly good, but it's not great. And I do have that issue with Heinlein. So, Assignment in Eternity. That's what I read last week for Rocket Summer. I'm reading another book for Rocket Summer right now, which is a great book. This is The Body Snatchers by Jack Finney. This is the 1960s edition of The Body Snatchers by Jack Finney, a book that was written in the 1950s. I'm reading it for this week, which is the 1950s in Rocket Summer. And it's a great book, and they made some great movies off of it. The first Invasion of the Body Snatchers from the 1950s was an excellent movie. The 1970s version was great. There was a version after that I don't remember too much about that was much different from the book from what I remember. And honestly, I don't remember much about it. But the book I remember being really good. And I just started it, and it's really good so far. So yeah, this is going to be a better week for me, I think. Just because I'm starting it with The Body Snatchers. And what I read after this, because this probably won't take me all week to read, I don't know. But I will tell you next week when I return. I did get something in the mail this week that I do want to mention. I got Occult Detective Magazine Mythos Special number 2. So they did come out, Occult Detective Magazine did come out with a Mythos Special number 1. Which I have, and I've intended to read, but I haven't read it yet. And then this came out, and I realized, wow, has it been a whole year since that Mythos Special number 1 came out? I guess. But this is available now. Occult Detective Magazine, Mythos Special number 2. Now, Occult Detective Magazine is pretty fantastic. It's a great magazine. So I have a feeling this is going to be pretty great. Mythos Special, basically that would be stories in the H.P. Lovecraft tradition, I'm assuming. And I really do need to read both the first and second Mythos Specials now, because I got this in the mail. And I really am happy that I got it. The editors at Occult Detective Magazine were kind enough to send this to me. So yeah, you should get this. You should all buy Occult Detective Magazine anyway, because it's a great, great magazine of wonderful occult detective fiction. So yeah, you should get this. You should get this. It's awesome. And I look forward to reading that. So yeah, that's what I read last week. I'm on book 162 of the challenge right now. And I will let you know all about it next week. I guess that's all I have to say for today, Roger. I will catch you next time.